Hello and welcome to the last section of Chapter 34 of the American Pageant for AP U.S. History or any U.S. history. We're looking at Chapter 34 is the Franklin Roosevelt in the Shadow of War. Today we're doing Charting a New World through America's transformation from bystander to belligerent. So let's get into it. Roosevelt has won re-election in 1940. Britain is fending for itself against the Nazis. They're completely alone. And America is stepping up its efforts to help out through the Land-Lease Act. At this point, Hitler calls off his invasion of Britain and invades his true enemy, the people that he always intended to invade. It's in Mein Kampf, the Soviet Union, because the Nazis needed, quote, living space. So on June 22nd, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Remember, Stalin and Hitler were allies, quasi-allies, with the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. Stalin was another shock. For a week, he was inconsolable. People couldn't get him to speak. He wouldn't respond to orders. He wouldn't give orders, what I mean. And finally, a week later, he's kind of snapped out of it and said, all right, let's take apart all the factories in the Ukraine and move them to the west, or move them to the east of the Ural Mountains. And they went, I think Stalin's still crazy. And he went, no, I'll end you. And they're like, oh, Stalin's back. So they literally took pieces. They took the factories apart piece by piece because they knew the Nazis were coming, and they moved them by train to the Ural Mountains and built factories out in the middle of nowhere because Stalin knew that this was going to be a long, drawn-out war. The Soviet Union's a vast, massive country. They needed war supplies, and he couldn't let those factories fall into the Nazi hands. This is all part of Operation Barbarossa. Very ambitious plan, very wide three-prong attack. Trying to push north to take Leningrad, which is modern-day St. Petersburg, Moscow, the central thrust, and then the southern prong was to take Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, and then push to the southeast to the Caspian Sea region for the oil fields. They were delayed by a Mediterranean campaign. Mussolini tried to invade Greece and needed help. And then there was a late spring, which is not a good deal. You don't want to be getting a late start when you're invading the Soviet Union. You don't believe me? Ask Napoleon. Eventually, the Nazis were so quick they outran their supply lines. They were slowed down by the Soviets using a narrower gauge of train track, actually, so they had to get new trains. And then also they got stuck by Russian winter. The Soviets employed a scorched earth campaign where they purposely retreated and burned and destroyed anything the Nazis could use. And then once Russian winter hit and those planes and those tanks didn't work, the Soviets launched a counterattack. So they used the scorched earth policy, very similar to what they did against Napoleon's Grand Army in the 1800s. Hitler, his own hatred of the Slavic people, hurt his war effort as well. Hitler, of course, was anti-Semitic, but he also hated Slavic people as well. And so he punished them. He put them in slave camps. He hauled out, the Nazis murdered the Slavs. And these people gladly would have joined. The Ukrainians especially probably would have joined up with Hitler to take out Stalin. They couldn't stand him. While this is going on, the United States and Britain meet off the coast of Newfoundland to discuss what to do after the war. The Atlantic Charter was signed by Churchill and FDR. They met in August 1941 to discuss what to do after the destruction of the Nazis. I want to remind you, this is 4 months before Pearl Harbor. The United States is not officially in the war. They are fighting an undeclared war on the high seas against the Nazis. They're doing Land-Lease, there's a peacetime draft, but the United States is not in this war, but they're already planning the post-war party. In this agreement, they talked about disarmament, freedom to choose one's government, free trade was kind of discussed, then also a new worldwide peacekeeping organization, one the United States would actually join and would be effective, the United Nations, what it would become. This is the official photograph from the Atlantic Charter, and if you look here, Roosevelt is standing, this is what was published in the newspaper, so the public was dumbfounded that the president was paralyzed because they saw pictures of him standing. What you don't see is the leg braces underneath his pants, and he's also being held up by this soldier's arm, who actually, coincidentally or not, is Roosevelt's son. And then you got Winston Churchill here, former admiral of the Navy, so he loves his naval uniform. This is Operation Barbarossa, which was launched June 22nd, 1941. This northern prong gets to Leningrad. They besiege the city for 900 days and never fully take the city. They get to the outskirts of Moscow before they're turned back. They do take Kiev, but then they're stopped by a little town right here, a little city that Hitler was obsessed with taking, named Stalingrad, because he wanted to rub it in Stalin's face when they humiliate him, and it becomes the bloodiest, deadliest battle in the history of mankind. From this point of Leningrad all the way down to Stalingrad is about 3,000 miles. So we're talking New York to Los Angeles is how broad this invasion was. This is an unexpected guess as the title of a political cartoon from 1941. The Brits and the Americans are hanging out, and now Stalin and Russia's crashing the party. So on the high seas, because Germany was sinking armament shipments, FDR decided to have American warships escort supplies to the British. This is July 1941. After a series of American boats were sunk by German U-boats, Congress voted officially to repeal the Neutrality Act. Going back to June 1941 here, the American warships had shoot-on-sight orders against the Nazis. If you see a submarine or a U-boat, sink it. That's the act of war. It's not the act of a neutral nation. By repealing the Neutrality Acts, it enabled merchant ships to be legally armed and to enter combat zones with munitions for the British. So now we need the official reason for the United States to get involved. On the other side of the world, you have the Japanese, who are very active. They've seized parts of China, parts of Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Korea. Everywhere you see the Japanese rising sun flag here on the map, this is where they had possessions. They also plan to take the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the Philippines, which coincidentally are all possessions of other countries, including this one, which was the United States is still. The Japanese were desperate for rubber and for oil and for other supplies to fuel their empire. They don't have natural resources really in Japan, and so the United States responded by freezing their assets. Basically saying, Japan, knock it off. You're being a bully. You can't touch your money. You know what? We're not going to let you have your money until you stop invading people. And Japan kind of calmly goes, all right, America, you're making a big mistake. They keep attacking, they keep invading, so the U.S. cuts off the sale of oil to the Japanese in the fall of 1941. The Japanese are very upset, cutting off the Japanese, their war machine and their oil production, or the oil purchases from the U.S. is like cutting off a drunk at the bar. It just is bad. And they warn us, basically, you're making a big mistake. We kind of try to leverage them and say, hey, look, if you leave China, we'll sell you oil again, which wasn't going to happen after all the vicious, awful, brutal things were going on in that area. Hideki Tojo officially takes over as prime minister in November 1941. He's an ally of the military, he has a military background. And so the United States at this point totally suspected the Japanese would attack them. But logically, with these flags here, you would think it would be the Philippines. Right here, it's in the area. Not Hawaii, which would be way off to the screen. You can't even find it on the map. But the attack on Pearl Harbor, one of the most infamous events in American history, one of those shocking and surprising events in American history. On December 7th, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., which was a Sunday morning, a lot of soldiers were sleeping in. Some had got up early to go to morning service. Hawaii was attacked. The island of Oahu, specifically. The battleships were all anchored in neat, nice, easy rows, which made them easy to bomb. In all, 8 battleships, 3 cruisers, 4 other ships, and 390 planes were destroyed. The planes were put out on the runways, wingtip to wingtip, for fear of sabotage on the ground, so they didn't have them in the hangars. Luckily for the United States, the aircraft carriers, the most vital piece of military hardware in the Pacific War, were all at sea. Some conspiracy nuts think that that was on purpose, and we knew Pearl Harbor was happening, man. Bush did Pearl Harbor and 9/11. This is the worst defeat in American military history, which isn't really fair because we didn't know there was supposed to be a match that day. The next day, the Japanese, very ambitious, attacked the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam, which are all U.S. possessions. So the attack was planned by Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the famed military leader of this Kudo Batai. The Kudo Batai was a carrier force, or a fighting force of 6 aircraft carriers and a bunch of other ships. They thought they could knock the United States out of the war. That one humiliating defeat, that the United States did not have the gumption or the spirit to fight, that we would just quit and go, oh, you win, and then they would knock us out and they could control the Philippines and not have to worry about retaliation. And so the Kudo Batai, like I said, had a force of 6 aircraft carriers plus others. There were 3 waves of planes planned. The first wave hit the battleships. The second wave was not as successful. The element of surprise was not there. The Americans fought back. The third wave was called off. And so when Admiral Nimitz, the head of the Navy, toured it weeks later, he said, we got them right where they want them. They made a big mistake. And they thought, what are you talking about, man? This is the worst defeat we've ever had. And he pointed out that if you look at this map, these dry docks here were undamaged. These boats that were sank, with the exception of the Arizona, was permanently crippled. And it's sadly, tragically, a watery grave for about 1,100 men. They could just drag these boats across and fix them right there and put them in service in a matter of months. He also said that the fuel reserves, the entire Pacific Fleet fuel was up in the mountains in tankers. They didn't attack that. They also didn't take a submarine base. And so the Japanese, by calling off that third wave, did not complete the job. In all, 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 wounded, 68 civilians were killed. The Japanese lost 29 planes and 64 men. This is a picture of the USS Virginia, one of the battleships that was crippled by the torpedoes and by the bombings, the high-level bombings coming on by the Japanese. This is Yamamoto who planned this here. This is actually a picture from a Japanese Euro. During the attack, you can see the battleships here in Battleship Row. They have keys there, and if you go to Pearl Harbor today to show where they were at. And then the very famous, the tragic USS Arizona, which was recently refueled and erupted like a volcano, killing and trapping over 1,000 men. So the next day, President Roosevelt asked formally for a declaration of war. You've heard the speech, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the Empire of Japan. And so Congress grants that declaration by a vote of, I believe, like 430 to 1. There was one senator, one congresswoman from Montana, Congresswoman Rankin, who said she supported the war, but she couldn't vote consciously to send men to die. The big question was what the U.S. was going to do with Germany. Well, they settled that issue 3 days later because we declared war on their ally. Italy and Germany declared war on us, and then we declared war back on them. It's interesting that both Hitler and Churchill took the same perspective from Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler said, now it is impossible for us to lose the war. Basically, like the United States is crippled, we're going to win. Churchill said, so we had won after all. England will win, will live. Kind of interesting take on this. There's a video on it. Pearl Harbor becomes a rallying point. It becomes a propaganda selling point to avenge Pearl Harbor, remember December 7th. This is the memorial of the USS Arizona that's still there today. If you go to Hawaii, I highly recommend it. This is actually aboard the USS Missouri, which is where the Japanese formally surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. You can tour that and get a good view of the Arizona. The Arizona is still underwater. It's a watery grave. It's very somber, and I highly recommend you go in there. So Pearl Harbor united Americans in their desire to go to war. No more bickering, no more America first. Let's go do this. People volunteered in large numbers. Prior to the attack, most Americans only supported policies that might lead to war, but this attack was so shocking that America was ready to do their part. That's all we have for this chapter. I hope to see you in the next one. If you have any questions, let me know.